Well, good afternoon, and welcome to our next MSC podcast. It's my pleasure to introduce today three members of the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency speechwriting team, and we're here to talk about ethics in speechwriting for the most part, and want to also talk a little bit about how you get your bosses to how you get into your boss's heads, and how do you learn to speak in their voice, and then how do you get them ready to talk when the time comes. With me today is Randy Lee and Jim Hickel and Scott Michaud from the NGA. So, gentlemen, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I look forward to this conversation because speechwriting is near and dear to my heart, and it's something that we as strategic communicators think we should be able to do, and it's one of the big responsibilities, if not actually writing speeches as a communicator. It's looking at speeches that folks that you have written and making sure that they're communicating the messages to the audiences that we're trying to address. And so I appreciate your taking the time out of your busy days. I know how busy you guys are, to talk to us about some of the ins and outs. So what I'd like to do is quickly kind of go around the table a little bit and ask you how it is that you came to do what you do. Randy?
Sure, happy to start. I was originally an Army officer, and my last 5 years in the Army I spent as a speechwriter. I sort of fell into it. I was stationed out in Hawaii, and speechwriter job came open, writing for a 4-star admiral. I thought, wow, that sounds like the coolest job in the world. I'd been an English major in college, and so threw my hat in the ring, did a sample speech, got picked, have stayed in it ever since for the last 19 years. Finished up my Army time, retired after moving to the Pentagon and writing for a couple of people at the Pentagon. And then I went to the American Medical Association and Georgetown University, and ended up back working at the government in the intelligence community.
Oh, what a fascinating journey. So I'm going to save Jim for last. Scott, can you tell us how you got into this job?
Sure. I actually started in Democratic politics, and I wound up becoming a speechwriter essentially because I could write, and a lot of the folks I worked with on the campaigns could not write. So I inherited a lot of responsibilities in terms of communications. Eventually led me to a job at the White House as senior editor to the president. And at that point, knowing the administration was going to be ending soon, I decided to throw my hat into the speechwriting ring and write for one of the cabinet secretaries before the end of the administration. And so I've been speechwriting on and off in Washington ever since.
Before we get to Jim, I got a quick question to ask you, Scott, and that is, do you notice a difference? So you say you got the first job because you could write.
Right.
Could you always write for the ear, or were you writing? Did they notice that you could write because you could write for the eye?
I would say it was probably writing for the eye first, but it was my responsibilities both in the Clinton campaign and in Albany were doing executive communications in terms of letters, messages, proclamations for executives. So trying to write in their voice anyway,
Right.
But on the written page rather than for the ear.
Fascinating, fascinating. What a great journey. So, and reason why I saved Jim for last is because his journey was different than the rest of your journeys.
But it was
Jim.
our fault.
It was your fault. Jim, how did you come to find this line of work?
Yeah, I got my first job in speechwriting because I could write. Same deal, only took a different path than Scott. I worked for Booz Allen in communications and change management, and it was actually the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency that was pounding us for a cleared speechwriter. Cleared speechwriters are impossible to find. If you like to write speeches, you like people to listen to the speeches. You don't want to write a classified speech. So we had a tremendous time trying to find somebody, and I finally said, you know what, I'll do it. I'll come to NGA, I'll be a speechwriter. So I trained myself to be a speechwriter for a couple of years. Retired about 5 years ago from Booz Allen. NGA calls me, says, now that you're retired, you want to come back and be a contract speechwriter? And I said, okay, and here I am.
What a great journey.
Yeah.
So, truth in advertising, Jim Hickel used to be my boss when I worked at Booz Allen Hamilton
My
many
boss
years
when I
ago.
worked at Booz Allen many years ago.
So, Jim, we would truly appreciate the journey you've given all of us.
Well, this has been a journey I wasn't expecting, so I'm glad you're all here with me.
One way or another, Jim's been everybody's boss. Anybody can be Frank Sinatra's son or daughter. Right?
When you get to be my age, you become everybody's boss, yes, at one point.
So before we get into the main topic, which is, of course, ethics in speechwriting, each of you has a lot of experience writing speeches. And you all work for military organizations, and bosses come and go in military organizations, and at high level, whether it's on the political side or the uniform side, your bosses tend to come and go. There's constant movement. How do you teach yourself to write like your boss?
I would say it's very important to listen to your boss. And by listen, I mean not just have conversations with them, but watch videos of them, watch them interact with other people in the organization, see if you can get them when they're talking to others about what it is they do and what their vision is for their organization, and just sort of absorb how they convey those messages.
It's nice to be a fly on the wall in meetings too sometimes, so you hear not just what they say, but how they say it. You can capture their vernacular, their idioms.
Do you ever, do any of your bosses have like a YouTube presence where you could go onto YouTube and see past things that they've said?
Yeah, you know, we just had a new deputy director come on board. And she was the former director of IARPA, which is another big agency. And she does have, I wouldn't say a channel or a big presence, but there were enough videos of her that we could look at her and get a preliminary sense of how she spoke, which, by the way, was fantastic. So that told us that we were there more for substance than for style. So you get some good information from watching that.
Super. Now, how do you learn what stories to tell? You have to, because that takes, I'm guessing here that you have to actually spend some time with the principal.
That's the ideal. That's the goal. If you can, if they'll grant you the time, you have an office call. When she came on board, we actually all went up to her office, asked her probably about 50 questions, and a lot of them were designed to learn personal stories about her and her personal preferences on things. And she was very, very helpful to us.
But again, you find them wherever you can, and you're not shy about stealing them. Absolutely not. If they're having a conversation and there's a story that comes up and you think it's pertinent to something you're working on, you absolutely say, hey, can I steal that?
Can I steal with quotation marks, right?
Quotation marks. I'm sorry, you can't see the quotation marks.
The other nice thing about something like that is if it's a story they're already comfortable telling and they've told it before, you could probably put one word on a speech and say, tell the
XYZ story, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
and take it away.
I just found out some great stuff about one of our officers. We interviewed her to make a speech, and we needed to get background. What was your background? She's going to talk about advancing your career and mentorship and guidance, that kind of thing. We asked her about her background. As it turns out, she grew up dirt poor with 8 siblings in her family. And she told us stories about how she had to overcome a lot of adversity to get to where she was. So A, great speech writing material. B, tells you a lot about some of the officers that I would have never known if we hadn't had that conversation.
Do you have the kind of relationships with your principals so that you can sit down and talk about them?
I mean, that is the hope. Your hope is that as a speechwriter, you're seen as a trusted advisor.
I guess that's where I was kind of going.
You're also, the hope is that you'll be an advocate both for the executive and for the audience. And that is something we all try to keep in mind as we're putting these remarks together, is how do we convey this message to this audience in a way that they're going to respond? And if you're only advocating for the person behind the podium, that makes it that much harder.
Right.
So wear a couple of hats.
And sometimes you have to protect the speaker, the person you're writing for, from himself or herself. If they would put something in a draft of a speech and you go, the audience knows that probably would go over like a lead balloon. You got to let the boss know that.
Right, and I imagine that in your particular, we're going to start to move a little bit into before this is going to start to move us into the ethics conversation about ethics, but just before we move into that, there's a third audience that I think that you have to be thinking about when you're writing a speech for your principal. So you talked about the audience, the public that you're addressing. You talked about the principal whose speech it is. But isn't there also the organization and the staff that comprises the organization? Because they're the ones that are really driving the messaging, right?
Well, so yes, there can be if you're writing for an agency or an organization.
Right, a large
political speech, though,
It's all about
the organization is the individual, right?
Right. So I get that. So it depends on the nature of the organization that you're writing for. A good point. In politics, the organization is the principal, but in government, and I think that most of our students, I mean, some of our students will find their way into politics, absolutely.
Yep.
But for the most part, our students are going to find their way into government or agency or commercial organization kind of positions, and I think that when you're working in that kind of an environment, you have that bureaucracy that is trying to move the organization, hopefully along the same lines that the principal is, but the organization is a third kind of an audience that you have to sometimes run your speeches through, right, to make sure that you're not speaking out of school, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so so you follow the staffing process to run your speeches through, and invariably the speech changes, right? So everyone has to put their little mark on the speech, and then the speech comes back to you and says, "Oh, it's ready for the boss to see now," and you look at it, and half the messages that perhaps as a result of your conversation with the boss, he or she wants to make, are gone because the staff couldn't agree on a position for the organization. How do you work that?
Well, so one of the things I think we've all experienced is that because the words coming out of the director's mouth are so powerful and sort of make things true, sometimes the staffing involves people trying to resolve policy differences through the remarks on the page. And so you'll get some conflicting guidance, or you'll get guidance that just doesn't align with either the message that you're trying to deliver or the vision and mission of the organization. So I think we're very careful about that, because once the words come out of the director's mouth, they become the reality of how we're doing things. So it is a battle. It's a running battle, and we're very thoughtful about it.
And you have to know, what got changed in the speech. Is that worth falling on your sword over?
Yeah.
Some things are, some things aren't. If there's something you're really passionate about, you may want to go actually talk to the director or the person you're writing for himself. Say, hey, this got lost. I'd like to put it back in.
So can I put a little contrarian view on this, because I have a much narrower perspective than either of you. And this all reminds me of an interview I saw with some big director. I don't know if it was Hitchcock or Scorsese or someone. And his point was the projectionist always has the final cut. And that means that no matter how well you cut the movie, if the projectionist shows it out of focus or shows it's going to be a bad movie, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's been my experience, is that we write for people who at the end of the day are going to say what they want to say. And there's a lot that's good about that. The fact they ad lib a little bit more in their own words makes it more compelling to the audience. But
it's usually a better speech that way.
Yeah, but we often, we could put it on paper and show it to them, but at the end of the day, they're sophisticated, they know the environment, and they're going to make decisions on what they say, regardless of what the staffing said or anything else.
But the middleman can be a problem sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's who we actually directly work for sometimes, right? Yeah. So we have to be careful on that as well.
When you prepare a speech for your principal, do you give the speech in pure prose? Do you do it in outline form, note cards?
I'm platform agnostic, which is to say, my goal is whatever will allow the principal to deliver their message most effectively. So sometimes it's talking points, sometimes it's fully scripted, sometimes it's just a PowerPoint presentation. Sometimes it's little tiny index cards.
And it varies because we write for like 7 different people.
And they all have their own
Right.
preferences. So you have to get to know their
do.
particular preferences,
Right.
the way they like
Yep.
they like to do it.
So I just had this experience recently too. We spoke to someone who hadn't made many speeches, and they asked us. We got in the conversation. Should they have talking points or should they have a script? And what I pushed was start with a script, because you haven't made that. I didn't say, wasn't this blunt. You haven't made that many speeches. You probably want a crutch, which is a written speech. If you look at it, you're comfortable with it, we'll cut it down into talking points for you. But usually, if someone doesn't have that much experience, I'll say, let us just script the whole thing out for you and see how that works.
And then you just have to write it so that it's easy for them to read and it sounds like they're spontaneous. Because you have cheats you can do as you write a speech with, for example, don't write the words all the way to the bottom. Have a nice big fat 3-inch margin on the bottom so they maintain more eye contact.
Oh, that's a good point.
And make sure the font is huge so they can look down, and make sure you use that 1 sentence per paragraph so they can kind of look up and down and keep going, and it seems much more natural than the last thing you want to do is have somebody read a page and their nose is buried in it, and you don't want to see the top of their head as they get down the bottom of the page or anything like
Yeah,
that.
part of the power of speeches is that you have eye contact with the audience, so you are in direct communication.
It's a
with
connection,
them.
right?
Yeah, it's a connection.
between the audience and the
Right.
principal.
Right. Speeches are probably the most expensive form of communication that we have, because you're really talking to relatively few audience members, but they're it's the most powerful because you have an emotional connection to the audience.
We just came from the Professional Speechwriters Association World Conference,
Yeah.
and that very point was made, how if you think about it, a speech is a pretty inefficient way of communicating these days, right? But it is maybe the most powerful thing when you have Martin Luther King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial.
Yeah.
It's probably one of the oldest,
Yeah.
right? One of
Yeah.
the oldest forms of communication. That's probably the
It is next
Right.
next to calligraphy and caves, right?
One thing you have to wrestle with, though, I don't know what your experience is. Mine is, I'm a little surprised that not everyone in the executive suite is a big ego who wants to be in front of people. Some people are introverts. They don't like doing it. And that may not necessarily be their favorite medium, but they're kind of sucked into it. So you have to provide them whatever support they need to make them be effective. And sometimes reading the speech isn't good, but sometimes it's a lot better than having someone like that try to not read the speech.
Well, I'm going to kind of jump ahead to the end before I get back to the middle, which is ethics. But so when you're working with a new executive or someone who's just not comfortable with public speaking, do you spend time with them practicing, going to the venue and letting them see what the venue is going to look like in advance? You do all that pre-work with your principals?
That's kind of out of our lane for the most part.
Yeah, we have a logistics organization that helps us with that. There are some speechwriters that are required to do all of that by themselves. We're set up a little differently.
So I did this with one person who wasn't necessarily a bad speaker, but I think I would use this in this case. With one person, I said, you know what, you want me to read the speech to you? And they said yes. So I'd read the speech and they'd listen to it. And so, okay, the next time I'm here, why don't you read the speech to me? And they read the speech, and I think that kind of helps to get them warmed up for.
Yeah, and that's really, I do that with my students that are listening to this. Is one of the biggest pieces of advice I give them when they're writing a paper that's meant for my eye. I said, read it out aloud. Do the sentences flow well? Do the thoughts make sense as you put them together?
Right.
And when you're doing speeches at work, I think that's even more important.
We certainly believe that. Speechwriters believe that. It is sometimes a struggle to make the executives make the time to do the homework they need to do to be effective, to be most effective, I should say. So that is something that's a running battle for us, I think.
Can I steal one of Randy's lines? I've learned a lot from Randy. This guy knows speechwriting inside and out. And one of the things, and I'm going to quote you, and you're sitting right here. One of these things that he says that I think is brilliant is that when you're dealing with a high-level executive, the upcoming speech is a C or D level priority until the day before the speech. And then it becomes
to the executive.
And then it becomes an A+ priority. Yes. So it's hard to get time with them until right before the speech, and then suddenly becomes a panic situation.
Right.
And that can be a problem to deal with.
Scott, you spent some time on the political side of the House
Yes.
before you came to the NGA. So, in the political side of the House, does the speechwriter have more time to spend with the principal and working through the logistics of putting on a speech?
That can be true, particularly because the only thing the politician is selling, in theory, is the words that they bring with them, right? So, words are very powerful on the political front, and they need to be invested in it. Now, having said that, it's only as likely as they're willing to put the work in, even in that environment. Obviously, if they're less good at giving speeches, they're less likely to be elected.
Right. Yeah. Politics might be a little bit different because if they don't already have that inner
Drive.
inner drive and ability, skill, if you will, to communicate verbally, they're probably not going to get too far in politics anyway. So yeah, I understand. Okay. Well, now we can actually shift to the main guts of this conversation, and that is ethics. You guys all work in a classified arena. And you can't always speak the whole truth because the whole truth may be a classified truth. I'm just kind of curious how you work through that inside of yourselves, and how does that reflect in the words you ask your principals to say?
Well, one thing is we're kind of fortunate in that NGA is not, it's an intelligence agency, but we're not sort of in the same business as CIA or DIA that sort of have to be a little more covert about things. And we even work in the humanitarian assistance, disaster response areas too. So most of the speeches that our bosses give are not about classified things. And even the ones they do give that are classified, we really try to write them unclassified. And if they want to get into classified stuff in the Q&A portion afterwards, if there's Q&A, then that's fine. But it helps because then you could possibly work on it on the unclassified system. And then this sounds maybe a little trite, but at the end of their time, when they left after 3 years, you want to give them a book of their speeches. And if every one of them is classified, it's going to be a pretty thin book.
Indeed.
So you can work around all that stuff.
So you made an interesting point, and that is that much of what NGA does, I take that back. Some of what NGA does is unclassified, it's humanitarian, and those are things that your bosses can speak about and get many of the messages that the communicators, the strategic communicators want to get out to the people about the value of your organization to the public, and so one of the things that we talk about with our students is that when you're writing speeches, you have to pick and choose your venues very carefully, and so you can pick venues that allow you to speak to the unclassified areas of the organization, and not focus so much on the classified. But we do also talk about Q&A, and the fact of the matter is you can't always control the questions that are coming. So you can direct the speech a certain way because those are the as we want to, because we can control the words coming out of the boss's mouth, but we can't control partly, but we can't control the questions that the boss is going to get.
Sometimes that's true. There are some venues where we will set things up, or the host will set things up so the questions are submitted ahead of time, or the questions are submitted on index cards to the moderator, who will decide which questions they call. So there are some filtering options there. The other thing you can do from a speechwriting perspective is to preempt questions that you think might be awkward by including language in the speech that addresses the concern in the way that you would like to have it addressed. So you get ahead of whatever that question is by saying, here's how we're dealing with X, Y, and Z, and here's our solution to X, Y, and Z. So you don't have uncomfortable questions necessarily coming up because they've already been preempted in your remarks.
I guess it's really important for you guys to monitor the news, because I assume that news can sometimes short circuit a speech.
Well, I mean, we devour all information. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just sort of who we are and what we do. But yeah, we pay attention to the news, not only for the issue of being concerned about what's happening, but also because topical issues are a connection to the audience just in and of themselves. So if you can talk about, the Nationals going to the World Series, then people are going to perk up a little bit in the audience, right?
You show them a picture of the Houston Astrodome from above. Well, it's amazing because I mean, you guys, the organization does do a lot of humanitarian work, and they do publish a lot of those photos, and I think that they are great subjects for your bosses to talk about, and they are a great way to demonstrate the quality of the workforce in the organization without giving up a lot of secrets.
It is, and there's a distinction we probably should make too, that we don't use photographs of the United States unless it's somehow directed by another agency on some type of like a hurricane.
I was going to say, like
Usually it's only-
Katrina, I
Yes.
swear that I could remember pictures coming from NGA of the hurricane area. Like we could see pictures before the hurricane and
Right.
after the hurricane.
We are mandated by law not to look at the United States unless another agency asks us to, usually for humanitarian aid.
So in Katrina's case, it was FEMA, I believe.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Okay.
we-
So
so
they're
we work
special.
it
So
for
those
FEMA.
are actually very special
They are.
cases
Right.
when that happens.
Yeah.
And it's governed by law. I assume there's
Right.
a whole process that has to go through.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. So let me ask, so we talk about the law, and what are some, so your guideposts that guide you ethically in your speech writing, you have the law, so you have to be cognizant of what the law says the organization is allowed to do and not allowed to do. Does NGA also have ethical codes of ethics? Do you follow the PRSA codes of ethics when you're doing your speech writing, or business communicators or the speech writers organization? Do they have a code of ethics?
NGA has what's
Core values.
the core values, which are it spells out Earth. NGA does have what we call our core values. E for excellence, A for accountability, R for respect, T for teamwork, H for honesty. Those spell out Earth, which we think is pretty cool. It's just a coincidence that they work out like that. And you can actually flip it around to spell heart too, which is a kind of an interesting visual technique when that happens. But in addition to that, there's also a code of ethics for the entire intelligence community. And that came about under D&I Clapper, Jim Clapper. And I was actually working for him when that happened. And his thought process was, to be treated as professionals in the intelligence community, like doctors and lawyers have a code of ethics, why can't intel professionals do it? And even though it's a huge margin of what people do, and most people don't do really scary things like a CIA case officer on a dusty road somewhere in Afghanistan, who might even have to kill somebody, in self-defense. But we are about kind of stealing and protecting secrets, and so there's a wide margin as to ethics on this. But is there an overall encompassing code of ethics? And they created one at OD&I. And so we were at a speech writing conference, and this came up, and we said, well, maybe if the intelligence community can have a code of ethics, how about speechwriters have one? So one was created a couple years ago by the Professional Speechwriters Association. And actually, I think you have some of, is it in that book there?
There's a whole chapter on
Yeah.
ethics in here. I don't know if the actual.
The book that we're looking at is The Political Speechwriter's Companion, A Guide for Writers and Speakers by Robert Lehrman and Eric Schnur.
Yes.
Yep,
Schnur. Just so you know, because they can't see it.
Bob Lehrman was one of the instrumental guys in actually, he really codified
Yeah.
more than any of the, a lot of us worked on it, but Bob worked that whole issue.
And Bob and Eric both worked in the White House as Al Gore's speechwriters back in the day.
So do these codes of ethics, do they work for you in your everyday work when you're trying to make decisions of what to include, what not to include, what Q's and A's, how to prepare your principles for the speeches they're going to give? Do you find them useful?
I wouldn't say we have them printed out and,
Yeah.
above us, but I think we've internalized most of them.
Yeah.
So
I think that's really the key. Is not. I think this is something ethics. My own sense is that ethics is not something that you need to memorize. It needs to be deeper inside of you than memorization. It needs to something way down inside of you needs to go tingle, tingle, tingle. You need to pay attention to this, because in my experience, ethical issues seldom just jump out at you and hit you over the head with a hammer. Typically, they sneak up on you, and it's a little thing. It starts out as a little thing by you as an individual round up your hours, instead of rounding or keeping them even, or your taxi fare was $11 and all of a sudden it becomes plus tip, right, or whatever, and those are little things that really nobody really would ever really care about, but what happens is that becomes taking a day off without charging, putting down a day of leave, and that becomes something else, and that becomes something else, and then all of a sudden you've done something that is catches the eye of a supervisor.
The only way we can be effective as speechwriters is if people trust us. So trust is very important to us as we do our jobs, and we're very cognizant of that, I think. So we have to be seen as a fair and honest advisor, have to be a trusted advisor.
And they have to have confidence that this is all fresh material, that it's not plagiarized.
I was just going to talk to you about plagiarism. It's a common problem, I think, in speech writing, and more, given transparency in the internet and all of the social media capabilities that we have, you hear of plagiarism becoming a problem more and more, whether it's book writing or speech writing.
Well, or in a college environment, just writ large.
Or in the exactly right. It's a problem everywhere, right? And I was just wondering, how do you deal with it personally? How do you ensure that your work isn't plagiarized?
That we're not plagiarizing someone else.
Yes.
I have to be very thoughtful about it, very careful about it. Part of it is how you go about collecting your information and saving your information. If you're saving a quote from someone else, you need to very clearly mark that in your files that this is a quote from so-and-so, and not just write down a stretch of words, because there's no guarantee when you go back to refer to that, you're going to remember that stretch of words is an actual word-for-word quote from somebody else.
Right.
So I think there's...
Can you run your do you run your speeches through software programs?
No, we don't. We don't.
I think the reason for that is that a lot of what we write is, in fact, public domain information. It involves humanitarian assistance or things like that. So a lot of it will come up as public information, but not necessarily we plagiarize. It'll signal it because it's in the news a lot. Those phrases are used repeatedly.
Or it comes from subject matter experts in our agency, and they're the ones who they have the best information. So they'll either be quoted or in my agency, this happened. So it's we know pretty much that we're not writing anything.
Yeah, I
That's
mean, that
sketchy.
seems like would be more of an issue for speechwriters working on more aspirational messaging, right? If you're trying to lift people up, you're trying to somehow convey some strong emotion, you're more likely to quote somebody who has captured that message very clearly. For us, we're talking more technical remarks as a rule. It's not a question of lifting the language up as if it were poetry.
When you're giving citing examples, your boss wants to make a point, and one of the great ways to do that is through exemplars. Do you have trouble sometimes giving credit? It's not a problem, especially, I suppose, within the classified world. It's not a problem, right? It's only if you were, if he or she was giving a public speech, trying to use an exemplar from within the agency.
Well, I mean, we have to make sure that it's unclassified. I mean, the classification requirements for us they're not negotiable.
Right.
So we do have a very rigorous classification management process.
Which actually Brooke has been a part of for years.
So we have a public release team. Brooke is just transitioning over from public release to.
We have a fifth person in the studio today. She's sitting off mic. She didn't want to sit around the table, but that's who Brooke is, and she just came. You just came from where?
Public release.
From the public relations part.
Public release.
Oh, public release. So when you write a speech, it goes to a third party, if you will, that scrubs it for security.
It's a different part of the team that just reviews it to make sure that everything checks out. There aren't any legal or classification problems. And it's only if the speech is going publicly.
If it's unclassified remarks.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So all right. So but unclassified remarks that stay inside
We
the
wouldn't
agency,
reveal. Yeah.
that you wouldn't look at
Right.
either.
Mhm.
What a
But so
fascinating.
Brooke's team keeps us out of trouble with our classification folks and our lawyers.
More than keeps us out of trouble, public releases come back with factual errors or editing errors or things. I mean, they say this is really beyond our scope, but you said this and it's really that. It's been really helpful. I kind of wish we did it on classified material.
We should just expand the reviewing pool,
Yeah.
right? Then we have lots of
There you
eyes,
go.
Yeah.
different perspectives. Could you actually talk about a little bit, going off on the plagiarism part, about how ways you do plagiarize yourself when you're using big parts of like the main theme of speeches, how you're reusing it in different speeches?
I don't know that plagiarism is
Right.
the right term for
It
that.
did make me think of it, though.
We're staying on message. We have a message. We're trying to convey it. So we will reuse language from previous speeches, but only really for the same executive. I mean, I would be very leery of using exactly the same words for a different executive unless they said, the director said X.
I know Randy has said like the I Have a Dream speech was a bunch of different iterations, and it was the same major theme that you reused. And
Well, one of the points that we talk about with our students is that the messaging that you see in a communications plan, the messages that are in the communications plan, are key messages. They're core messages. And you're going to see variations of those words, in many, many different products. And that's because you want to get the idea that's in the messages across to different audiences who absorb information differently. And so the ideas of those messages you'll see repeated all the time, and you'll see the words vary somewhat in order to get those ideas across to those different audiences that think differently or have different world experiences. So you have to use different words. You would not get use the same words with a boomer like myself as you would with a millennial or a Gen Zer, because our experiences are different. The way we express ourselves is different. And so the idea might be the same, but the words
Yeah.
are different.
The sitcoms are different, right? You don't want to quote the wrong sitcom if the
Exactly.
millennials have no idea what
I mean,
you're
we all
talking
like
about.
emojis, so we're all good.
Exactly. Can you talk to me a little bit about confidentiality? Earlier in our conversation, you had mentioned that how important it is to get that relationship underway with your principal, and because principals are coming and going, you need to get to know them very quickly. You had mentioned that you need to be the honest broker, and that you develop this sense of trust. How difficult do you find it to maintain confidentiality with your conversations with the principal when you're amongst the staff discussing whatever the topic of the speech might be?
I don't think that's a problem for us at all, really. I mean, if we're talking to the staff and we say the director wants to talk about this, that's part of us doing our due diligence to get to where he wants to be. I'd say the larger confidentiality issue we face as speechwriters is that we're not supposed to talk about our experiences with an executive outside of working with that executive. This goes back to being trusted. If they don't trust us to be thoughtful about their conversations and the speeches that you work on with them, you're not going to be invited back in the room, and frankly, you'll be very hard pressed to be employed as a speechwriter ever again.
Because you get personal. You when you're in the natural course of discussing the speech, you talk about personal things.
It is rare to see a tell-all book from a speechwriter.
I can't begin to tell you. I can't believe our time is gone so fast. But we have. I just, if I could just touch on one thing before we go, and that is Q&As. So you write a speech. Do you get involved in the Q&A process at all?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
When you do, what is your? Do you sit? So you sit there and formulate potential questions for the principal?
We usually staff them out to the experts and then consolidate them and eliminate redundancies and
So part of our due diligence is to make sure that we don't have a quiet room at the end of the remarks, right? If no one asks a question, we want to make sure we have some questions that we would like to have asked. So we'll do that work ahead of time to make sure we know what they ought to be.
And there's another tip in writing a speech that has Q&A, and that you can't, a lot of times, most of the time, you can't control the questions if they're just coming up from the audience. And if there's a real humdinger at the end, either a sensitive question or the boss just somehow butchers the last answer, you want to save a second closing, a second ending for the speech, so you don't end on a sour note.
After the Q&As,
right.
you'll end the speech, have the Q&As, and then have another ending.
Exactly.
Oh, that's a great idea. That's super. Well, gentlemen and Brooke, thank you very, very much. Jim, Scott, Randy, I truly do appreciate the time that you've taken to speak with us. I know that it's going to provide tremendous insight for my students as they work towards their degrees, and hopefully will, as they start to choose their career paths in the strategic communications arena. So thank you very, very much again for making the trip out to Largo, Maryland today.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us. Yeah. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cut. That was good. We went way long. We went way long.